Welcome back, macroeconomists. Today we're going to be talking about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So this is one of the last models we're going to implement this semester. So a big part of macroeconomics is the fluctuations of overall economies. So when we look at the ASAD model, also known as aggregate demand, aggregate supply, we're going to be looking at what causes these fluctuations, what happens with these fluctuations throughout time, and how do we counteract these with different policies. And this is a really interesting concept, especially in today's day and age with COVID-19, seeing what different economies, governments, central banks are implementing due to this. So all that is tied into this, and it's very applicable to what we're talking about and what we're seeing around the world at the moment. So chapter 20, we're going to get started. So economic activity, this fluctuates from year to year. There's always either an increase, decrease, there's various periods in time. We're not always just stagnant. We're constantly changing. So some of these fluctuations, we often call this the business cycle. So there's different phases to this business cycle. We have recessions, we have depressions, we have periods of growth, we have booms, busts. All these things are interrelated in terms of the business cycle. So a recession is economic contraction. So this is a period of declining real incomes and rising unemployment. So usually this has to occur for 2 quarters or more. And a depression is just a severe version of a recession. So what we're in right now, people are predicting it to be a recession. We won't know until the second quarter numbers are announced, which will be sometime in, I want to say, August. So we'll see where we are with all this. Other important things to know, ASAD model focuses on short run fluctuations. So when we look at short run versus long run, there's various components that we'll look at that determine each of its impact. Now, basic economists, what we use this model for is to provide a solution. We want to provide a solution or recommendation to help mitigate for this problem, so like a recession or depression in the future or large periods of inflation. So we have recessionary periods, we have expansionary periods or inflationary periods, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we look at graphs. So 3 key facts about economic fluctuations. These fluctuations are irregular and unpredictable. So that is what the business cycle is. No one can predict when we're going into a recession. Again, we can make educated guesses, we can make forecasts, but at the end of the day, it's really hard to pinpoint, okay, we started a recession today, right now, and so forth. So again, it's unpredictable. There's various things that can cause this. So for example, right now, COVID-19, a lot of people didn't see this coming. Nobody 6 or 7 months from now or ago knew that this was going to happen and this was going to be the impact. And same thing with the recession of 2008. That's another key example. And also most macroeconomic quantities fluctuate together. So recessions, it's a company-wide phenomenon. It's not just one group is affected. There's multiple groups that are affected, as well as our macroeconomic indicators. So for example, income, production, and spending all move together. So during a recession, we see a decrease in output, which also means that if there's a decrease in output, there's an increase in unemployment. Now, if there's a decrease in output and increase in unemployment, less people have jobs. Because less people have jobs, they're spending less, producing less, and incomes are much lower. So those are the key macroeconomic factors we'll look at is output, unemployment, and then price levels. So we'll see how these are all interrelated graphically. So as output falls, unemployment rises. So on average, the United States has, over the last 50 years, U.S. real GDP, so the measure of output, has grown about 3% per year. This year might be a little different, but for the most part, we have grown 3%. That's pretty constant with fluctuations here and there. There are periods where we contract, where output decreases, income decreases, but unemployment increases. And again, these are recessions. These are mild responses to these fluctuations, and depression is much more severe. So here we have a graph showing the real GDP, U.S. real GDP over time, so from 1970 to 2015. So we have been on a trend of growth, but this red, here, let me just use my handy dandy laser. So this period right here, this is from 2008 to 2009, we see a decrease in growth, but then eventually we bounce back. So on average, we've always bounced back after a recession or a lack of growth. So again, this is what we're going to be looking at with these examples. So we also have investment spending. You see that it also changes. People aren't going to be investing as much when production is low or when you're in a recession or a depression. And then here we have the unemployment rate. As predicted in periods of growth, you see unemployment rate be much lower. So after the recession, we saw a huge decrease in unemployment rate, and the lowest it's been is around 3%, which is really good for the United States. But now we're starting to see it spike again. So again, another indication of a recession. All right, so there's a couple different schools of thought when it comes to short run and long run fluctuations. When we talk about the classical dichotomy and monetary neutrality, this is for classical economists. When you think of classical economists, think of economists that want very little influence on the market. It's a hands-off approach, and they want everything to just self-adjust. So a couple of things that we need to look at is a definition of each. So the classical dichotomy is the separation of variables into real and nominal. So we know what real means. Real is controlling for inflation. Nominal variables are looking at it from year-to-year basis with no controlling for any type of behavior. And then monetary neutrality. This is basically saying any changes in money supply is going to affect nominal variables, but not real variables. So real variables, for example, are, I'm blanking, real GDP, unemployment, output. So all those factors are not affected by changes in money supply. So when we go over chapter 16, so I know we're kind of going 20 and 16, but it'll make much more sense when we get to chapter 16. But for now, money neutrality is just saying changes in money supply only affect nominal variables. So it only affect prices and wages, but it will not have any effect on important economic factors or indicators. So real GDP, unemployment, all those other factors will not be affected, only prices and wages and so forth. So the classical theory holds in the long run. So again, part of their way of thinking is it holds in the long run. So changes in the money supply, they affect prices and other nominal variables, but it doesn't affect real GDP, unemployment, or other real variables. So basically what I just mentioned, we focus on changing prices and wages, so something much more current. And our long run, it does not affect our overall production. So just because we print more money is not going to mean it's going to affect unemployment or it's going to affect our overall output. That's not the way this theory approaches it. Now, in the short run, assumptions of monetary neutrality is no longer appropriate. So this is where we come up with the whole Keynesian economic approach. Basically, Keynesian economics is focused on the short run, where we want to see we pay more attention to the short run because of these fluctuations. Now, a classical economist will be focused on the long run, and yes, they do care about the short run, but they think it will just self-adjust to the outcomes. Now, in the short run, real and nominal variables are highly intertwined. So changes in money supply, so again, this is a new theory, changes in money supply can temporarily push real GDP away from its long-run trend. So we'll see how different outcomes affect our short-run equilibrium and our long-run equilibrium and all of that. So our ADAS model, or ASAD, whatever you prefer calling it, it's aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Now, most economists use it to explain short-run fluctuations in economic activity around its long-run trend. So we'll dissect aggregate demand, then we'll dissect long-run aggregate supply, then short-run aggregate supply. So the most confusing part about all of this is we have 3 curves as opposed to 2. So a lot of students, what they confuse it with is just the regular supply and demand model, which is not going to be the case here. So the aggregate demand curve, this shows the quantity of goods and services that households, firms, governments, and customers abroad want to buy at each price level. So when you think of aggregate demand, think of GDP. That's one of the easiest ways to think of it. Think of the formula. So C plus I plus G plus NX. And we'll see why we look at that in a bit. Just know it is downward sloping. So when I post my next video, it's going to be a practice problem Basically, we're going to walk through all the steps, how to draw it, how to interpret it, and so forth. So it's a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Aggregate supply curve. Now we have two different aggregate supply curves. So we have short run and we also have long run. A aggregate supply curve, the short run and long run, they both show quantities of goods and services that a firm chooses to produce and sell at each price level. So the only similarity this has with our normal demand and supply model, it is upward sloping. All right, so here we just have two of our curves illustrated. We'll talk more about the other one in a bit. So the big difference here, we have our price level on our Y. So we've already talked about two different types of price levels. We've talked about our GDP deflator and also our CPI. So if you're ever given any of those, you know that you can use that for your ASAD model. And then on our X, it's the quantity of output. So it can be quantity of output, or sometimes you might see real GDP or Y. So again, real GDP is another measure of output. So our aggregate demand, downward sloping, aggregate supply, upward sloping. Now when our short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect, that is our short run equilibrium. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. All right, so aggregate demand. So when I talked about thinking of it as your GDP formula, the reason being is because consumption, investment, and net exports and government spending all are interrelated in aggregate demand. So we're looking at the overall economy. We're looking at consumption behaviors, investment, government policies that are implemented, and how we're trading with other countries. So there's three reasons why our aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. It's the wealth effect, interest rate effect, exchange rate effect, and we're going to talk about each single one of those. Now, government spending is fixed by policy. So anytime we have a policy that increases government spending, it's just going to be a direct increase. If we see a decrease in government spending, it's going to be a decrease. Now, wealth rate or wealth effect, interest rate effect, and exchange rate effect have different impacts on this downward sloping curve. All right, so price level and consumption are related. So we're going to start with the wealth effect. So let's just say there's a decrease in the price level. So if you can imagine your graph, you have a lower price level, the output is much higher. Now the reason being is because the lower the price level, we'll see an increase in the real value of money. So let's just say everything becomes 50% cheaper at your favorite store, and you're still making the same amount of money. Now you can purchase much more because your income is worth much more. Again, price levels have decreased, but your value of money has become stronger because of this decrease in price level. So consumers feel like they're wealthier, so they increase spending. So basically at the end of this, you increase the quantity demanded of goods and services. So again, if you see a decrease in price levels, but your income stays the same, you can purchase much more, you feel wealthier, you're gonna go out and spend more. Again, we're looking at the grand scheme of things, so everything all intertwined and looking at it through a bigger lens. So it's not just looking at one individual, it's looking at all individuals within our economy. All right, price level and investment, so the interest rate effect. So if there's a decrease in price level, the main thing to note is there's a decrease in interest rate. And anytime you see lower interest rates, this encourages investments. It encourages investments because you're paying less back to the bank. So instead of paying 5% back on a loan, let's just say you're paying 2%. That difference is saving you money, you're spending less money, you're getting more for your dollar, so to speak. So if there's a decrease in price level, there's a decrease in interest rate, and because of the decrease in interest rate, you want to increase your spending on investment goods. Now, because you increase the spending on investment goods, this increases the quantity demanded of goods and services. So the real GDP is increasing because of this. All right, price level and net exports. This is the exchange rate effect. So if we're looking at two different countries, we have the United States and let's just say China. So let's say there's a decrease in the US price level, meaning our goods and services are much cheaper. That means there's also a decrease in interest rate, right? We talked about that before. And also the US dollar depreciates. Now, when you think of depreciates, think of your dollar being worth less. Now, your US dollar is worth less, but let's just say the Chinese currency is worth much more, and you can purchase more US products. You can purchase more U.S. products because your current or this foreign currency, so this Chinese currency, is much stronger than the U.S. dollar. You can purchase more dollars with your currency, so you're going to see a huge increase in net exports. More people want your products or U.S. products because they are cheaper. Their currency is stronger, our currency is weaker. They can get more for their currency. So this also increases quantity demanded of goods and services. So the lower the price levels in the United States, the more that people want to purchase our products that are made in-house, because the lower the price level, you can get more for your money, basically. All right, so in summary, a fall in price level, there's an increase in quantity of goods and services demanded because consumers are wealthier. This stimulates demand for consumption goods. Interest rates fall. Again, lower interest rates, the more you want to invest. Currency depreciates. This stimulates demand for net exports. We're going to be exporting much more because people want to purchase our products because it's cheaper for them. Now, if you look on the other side, if there's an increase in the price level, basically consumers are poor. So if the higher the price level and our incomes don't change, basically we're going to go out and spend less. This depresses consumer spending. The higher the price level, the higher the interest rate. So interest rate and price level move together. So the higher the interest rate, the less we want to invest, because instead of paying 5%, now we're paying 10% on a loan, and less people, this discourages spending and borrowing. Now the higher the price level, the more your currency appreciates, basically meaning your currency is much stronger. Now less people want to purchase dollars or purchase products here because it's going to be costing them more of their currency. So there's decrease in exports. So here's a graph that's just looking at what we just talked about, an increase in price level, decrease in price level, what it means. So here, as price level increases, real GDP or quantity of output decreases. As price level decreases, it increases. All right, so we're going to talk about shift factors. So there's shift factors that you need to memorize for this model as well. The AD curve might shift based on the 4 components of GDP. So this is why I tell all my students to memorize the formula for GDP: consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. Any effect to these or any change, so increase or decrease in one of these, is going to shift your curve accordingly. So changes in consumption, or C, so events that change how much people want to consume at a given price level. Changes in taxes and wealth. So if I say we increase taxes, basically the tax rate goes from, let's say, 10% to 30%. That means less people have money to spend. If less people have money to spend, they're going to go out and spend less. They decrease their consumption. So that's how taxes can be affected. If you want to increase consumer spending, you would want to decrease taxes. Let's just say we go from 10% to 2% tax rate. If we do that, more people have money or you have much more disposable income, and you're going to go out and spend money. So again, think of different ways you can impact consumer spending, and mostly it's through taxes. So if I give you a question saying, okay, I increase taxes, that means people are going to be spending less because they have less money to spend. Now, if I say we decrease taxes, they're going to have much more money to spend. So it's going to be a shift to the right. So increase in demand is to the right, decrease in demand is to the left. Changes in investment. So events that change how much firms want to invest at a given price level. So if there's better technology available, a tax policy, or money supply. So this would increase investment. It's going to, again, shift to the right. So if I say there's a huge tax break for firms that implement a new type of technology, there's incentive. Now, if there's incentive, they're going to go out and invest more. Now, let's just say there's less technology available, or there's a huge tax on these firms for using a certain type of technology. This is going to decrease investment. Changes in government spending or government purchases. So policymakers, they change government spending at a given price level. So let's just say there's a new government program that says we're going to build new roads. This is the government saying that they're going to pump money into our economy by building new roads. So you'll see an increase in government spending, and overall, your real GDP is going to increase as well. So if you increase in government purchases, it's going to increase or shift your demand curve, aggregate demand curve, to the right. So again, when the government pumps in more money into the economy, or if you see the G portion of our GDP formula increase, your overall aggregate demand is going to shift to the right as well. Changes in net exports, so an event that can change net exports for a given price level. So let's just say there's a recession in Europe. If there's a recession in Europe, less people want to purchase our products because they have less money. It's going to have an impact on our overall. It's going to have less impact on our overall trade. So if they have less money to spend, they're going to want to trade less with us because they have less, obviously, money to spend. Increase in net exports, your curve is going to shift to the right. So a specific example would be, let's just say Spain is going through, or Spain and France are going through a huge problem with COVID-19, and they can't afford to trade as much. So let's just say that they aren't trading as much with the United States. Let's say we're huge trading partners and we're one of their main, we export a lot of our products to them. If they're in a recession and they can't afford to purchase our products or trade with us, that means the United States real GDP or net exports is going to decrease. It's going to decrease because net exports is exports minus imports. If we're exporting much less to these countries, it's going to have an impact on our aggregate demand. Now, let's just say our products are somehow cheaper and Spain and France want to trade much more with us, even though they're in a recession. The United States is going to see an increase in our aggregate demand because net exports has gone up. If we're exporting much more because our products are cheaper, then purchasing those same products in France or in Spain, it's going to be much easier for them to do that, and you'll see a shift in aggregate demand. All right, so now we're going to talk about long-run aggregate supply curve. So this is a vertical curve. So think of our short-run equilibrium. Now just draw a line right through that. Now that vertical line is our long-run aggregate supply. Now price level does not affect the long-run determinants of GDP. So your long-run aggregate supply is based on supplies of labor, capital, natural resources, and technology. So just think of this as your potential. So when we thought of PPF, and we thought of the curve, that's showing all of our potential given all the resources that we have. So the long-run aggregate supply is very similar to that. It's basically our potential given everything that we own right now. And the only thing that's going to affect it is if we get more land, labor, capital, or technology. Now, the short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. We'll talk about that too. So here is where I was talking about the long-run aggregate supply. Again, price level, even if we increase price level, this does not change our overall potential. Again, it has no impact. Now, we call this the natural level of output because given all of our resources, so land, labor, capital, technology, given all of our resources, this is the maximum amount that we can produce. Now, that's our long-run aggregate supply, our maximum potential. Now, there's ways that this curve can shift based on what I've mentioned so far. So natural level of output is production of goods and services that an economy can achieve in the long run when unemployment is at its normal rate. So again, in the long run, we're assuming that it's we are at our natural rate of unemployment. This is our potential output at full employment. So when we say full employment, this is not saying that we have 100% of our labor force working, or we don't have 100% labor force participation rate. Again, it's our natural rate of unemployment. So let's just say the United States is less than 5%. So 95% of our workers are working. That is our full employment. That's what we're going to be assuming. So natural level of output is our potential. Now the shift factors for our long-run aggregate supply curve are any changes in natural level of output. So changes in land, labor, capital, natural resources, or technology, or technological knowledge. So for example, if I say, you're a country and you see a huge increase in individuals that are migrating to your country. You're going to see an increase in labor, obviously. And because of that, your long-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right. You have more available to you. Your potential in the long run is going to change. So here we have our changes in labor. So quantity of labor increases. Aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. Natural rate of unemployment increases. It's also going to, your aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left. So natural rate of unemployment increases. So if we have more individuals that are not working, our output or our long run output or potential is going to decrease as well. Let's just say we have a huge pandemic that, okay, let's scratch that. Let's just say there's a huge storm that reduces our population by 10%. Our overall potential or our long run potential is going to decrease. Changes in capital. So if we have more capital available to us, we can obviously provide more and produce more. And then also if we have more physical and human capital. So human capital meaning knowledge, education. If we're a much more educated society, we can produce much more. Natural resources. If we have better and more natural resources available to us, it's going to shift to the right. And then changes in technology. This is always going to help you. So anytime you see new technology, it will always shift your long run aggregate supply curve to the right. All right. Talk about that. All right, so the aggregate supply curve slopes upward. So now we're talking about the short run aggregate supply curve. This is price level affects the economy's output. There's an increase in overall price levels in the economy. So when we think of aggregate supply, think of firms. So how firms produce, and they're still incentivized by prices. So if there's a decrease in the level of prices, this tends to reduce the quantity of goods and services supplied. The higher the price level, the more incentive there is. So here we have the upward sloping curve, basically what we talked about before. So these are the three theories that explain the AS curve slopes upward in the short run: the sticky wage theory, sticky price theory, and misperceptions theory. So I'm only going to test you on the sticky wage, and we'll talk about the sticky price theory. I'm not going to test you on misperceptions theory. I'm not going to even talk about it. So the sticky wage theory, basically nominal wages are slow to adjust to economic conditions. So if we have contracts that are set in place, it takes some time to adjust. So when we have cost of living adjustments, if we have inflation, all these other factors. So nominal wages based on expected prices don't respond immediately when actual price level different from what was expected. So there are some changes that you make in the short run that don't essentially carry over just right then and there. So if overall price levels change, they don't just change overnight. It's a slow adjustment, so we call it sticky. It's stuck in one place, but eventually it does change. So this is an easier way to put it. So the sticky wage theory, if the price level is less than what they expected, firms have incentive to produce less output. So if the price level, the actual price level is less than what they expected, if they expected, let's just say a price level of 100, and the actual price level is 90, they're going to produce less because price level is lower. Again, they're incentivized by higher price levels. Now, if the price level is greater than what they expected, so if they expected 100 and the actual price level is 120, they have much more incentive to produce much more. All right, sticky price theory. Price of some goods and services, they're slow to adjust to economic conditions. For example, menu costs, so cost to adjusting prices. Basically, if we say, so when you think of menu costs, think of a restaurant. Basically, if they have to print new menus with new prices, that's what the time it takes from them to adjust the price. It's not just, okay, we're just going to change one price of one product and then leave the rest of the menu the same. If overall prices increase, there is a time period. Again, this is why it's sticky. There's going to be a time period from change to change, and it will eventually change. It's not just overnight. So we're not going to talk about the misperceptions theory. Now the short run aggregate supply curve might shift. So these are the shift factors. Changes in labor, capital, natural resources, or technological knowledge. So if anything affects our long run output, it's obviously going to affect our short run. So if we have an increase in migration, we have more people in our country or in our economy, we're going to be able to produce much more in the long run. Again, it's going to pull our short run curve with it as well. Now, another key shift factor for short run aggregate supply curve is expected price levels. So if they expect a higher price level, they're going to produce more. Lower price level, they're going to produce less. Okay, and then for other shift factors for our short run aggregate supply is going to be energy or labor prices. So if it becomes cheaper to produce your product, so if oil, energy, or oil, gas, electricity, different forms of energy become cheaper, you're going to produce much more. It's going to shift to the right. If energy becomes more expensive, you're going to produce less, so it's going to shift to our left. So if expected price levels increase, aggregate supply curve should shift to the right. So that's the typo here. It should be shift to the right because if they expect higher prices, they're going to go out and produce much more. All right, so causes of economic fluctuations. Here, okay, so here we have our long-run equilibrium. Our long-run equilibrium is where all three curves intersect. So at point A is our long-run equilibrium. Three curves have to intersect. AD, short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply. Now, our natural level of output, this is how much we should produce given all of our resources and unemployment for at full employment based on everything. So this is our long-run equilibrium. It's short-run equilibrium when it's just two intersections. So if it's just short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, that's only going to be our short-run equilibrium. Our goal is to always be in long-run equilibrium. Okay, so talk a little bit more about the steps. So if there's a shift in aggregate demand, so let's just say there's a wave of pessimism. Basically, people are less likely to go out and invest, less likely to go out and spend. If they're going to do that, that's going to affect our aggregate demand. Again, anything that affects consumers, most likely geared towards our aggregate demand. Again, AD is based on consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. Now, in the short run, our output falls and our price level falls. So if AD shifts to the left, this curve, hold up, let me get fancy with it. So our curve is going to shift to the left. This is our new AD. Again, extremely difficult. AD1, this is AD0. Now, our new equilibrium is this point right here. We'll call this point B. So this is point B. Now, because of this, we see our price level has decreased and our output has decreased as well. So our potential is still at our long-run aggregate supply. That hasn't changed whatsoever. So our price levels decreased, our natural level of output have decreased, and another question I usually ask is what happened to unemployment? The main thing you should know is there's an inverse relationship between changes in output and unemployment. So if unemployment or if output goes down, unemployment goes up. If output goes up, unemployment goes down. So again, inverse relationship. Here you're seeing unemployment go up because we're producing less because of this pessimism. Now, if we wanted to get, our goal is to always get back to our long-run equilibrium. The goal is to always get back to B. Now, there's two different ways we can get there. So if I just put a point right here as well, we'll call this C. Now, there's two options you have. You can get back to point A or you can get back to point C. The way to get back to point A is going to be influence our aggregate demand. If we want to influence our aggregate demand, we want to stimulate aggregate demand. Basically, if we decrease taxes, this could fix this. If we increase government spending, this could fix it. If we export more, this could fix it. So basically, you're given this problem. You start in the long run, equilibrium. You have an event. It's going to shift your curve or one of your curves one way, and your goal is to get back to long run aggregate supply. So your goal is to get back there, and the way you get back there is sometimes up to you if it's a free response. Sometimes it might be much more specific if I want you to shift your aggregate demand. So here, during this pandemic, we're seeing the government and central bank trying to incentivize or stimulate aggregate demand. We want to increase our spending by our consumers. We want to increase investment, increase government spending, all of those to help push us back to point A, let's say. All right. Now, in the long run, short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. So if we were just to let this self-adjust. So I'll draw it back again really quickly. This is C, this is B. So if we were to just say we wanted to let it self-adjust and do nothing, so this is the classical approach. Classical economists believe in just letting the economy self-adjust. You don't have to implement anything. Eventually, we'll get back to our natural level of natural level of output without having to implement any policy. Now, that would mean our short-run aggregate supply is going to shift this way. So one way you could do it is going from A to B and then B to C. Now, a Keynesian economist would say that we do need government policy during these times of need, and you would want to go from B to A. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Okay, so these are the 4 steps of analyzing macroeconomic fluctuations. You always want to decide whether the event shifts the AD curve or the AS curve, and sometimes it affects both. So in our practice problems, we'll do a little bit of both. Decide which direction the curve shifts. Use the diagram of the ASAD model to determine the impact of output and the price level in the short run, and then you want to get back to your long run equilibrium. So here we have a example. So we're starting at point A, again very similar to what we had, and what we're going to say is there's a contraction in aggregate demand. So people are pessimistic about the economy. They're going to be spending much less. So you go from, in this case, AD1, let me get my laser out, AD1 to AD2, so you're at point B. So now you're in this new phase. This is our short run equilibrium. B is our short run equilibrium. You always start at A. A is your long run. You see your event. This is your new short run equilibrium. Now your goal is to get back to your long run equilibrium. So you can get back to point C by just self-adjusting, or there's different policies that we can look at for this. So just for today, this is going to be it. This is just all the lecture. The next couple of videos will be practice problems on things that you should know. There's a help sheet posted as well. If you guys have any questions, drop a comment, send me an email, join the Zoom sessions. They've been fairly helpful for the students that have been joining. And yeah, there'll be a worksheet posted, a help sheet. There'll be a lot of different things. This is going to be a big part of your next exam as well as the final. So please make sure you understand this. Take some time, watch through it. If you have questions, let me know. Other than that, I hope you guys have a good day. And yeah, thank you guys. I will see you soon.